to share some perspectives from the Caribbean, as well as to learn about the actions, perspectives, and strategies for wider futures envisioned by those of us participating in this conference. I also wish to especially thank Maisha Dilshani for her kind support in facilitating my virtual participation. And like I said, I really regret not being there, and I do look forward to coming to the 7 conference in person. I come to this talk to this year's theme, to address this year's theme, Gender and Sexuality in the 21st Century. Why does it matter? With a great sense of humility and urgency. I'm of course humbled in the knowledge that much thoughtful engagement on this theme has featured in the previous 5 conferences and continues with presentations and discussions to have occurred so far in this year's installation. And I come to this conversation as a Caribbean Black feminist doer and thinker, indebted to the labor and care, teachings and mentorship of generations of feminist women, queer Caribbean people, family women, and family people and friends. What remains urgent is that while the world is literally burning, displacing those made most vulnerable among us, with far more immediate consequences for those of us who live in regions with histories of colonial and imperialist exploitation, connections to these histories as constitutive of the violences of our times are absented from mainstream public engagements. The planet is burning as a consequence of global warming, climate change, increased militarization, racial capitalism, and neoliberal economic arrangements with Black, Brown, Indigenous, and economically disadvantaged people most likely to burn with it. Gender and sexuality figure fundamentally in how we make sense of and seek to shift these conditions. As a Black Caribbean feminist, I have primarily conducted sociological research on gendered violence and methodologies for studying violence, as you've heard in the bio. I have also co-created curriculum for school-age youth on gender relations and gendered violence. This evening, I focus on my most recent reflections on gender, sexuality, and gendered violence, with reference to the Caribbean, to think about the fundamental ways in which gender and sexuality continue to matter. Unconscionable enactments of violence remain one of the enduring features of the emergence of the Caribbean and several other regions of the world. Embedded in this making and remaking of the colonial state is a history of labor exploitation maintained by racial, sexual, and gendered stratification that profoundly shapes how we make life in the Caribbean. In these arrangements, gender and sexuality, in their multiple registers, emerge as key relations of power and difference. Gendered violence and gender and sexuality as sites of violence figure prominently as well in how the Caribbean is experienced in the life of women, girls, and persons with queer and minoritized genders and sexualities. This is also true of other regions of the world. Even as delineating gendered and sexual harms remain urgent, Tracy Robinson's cautions that we should hesitate to project victimhood or a propensity for violation as a primary source of women's identity. As in the Caribbean, we live in spite of and beyond violence. Similarly, in his recent book, Defiant Bodies, Making Queer Communities in the Anglophone Caribbean, Nikolai Attai carefully curates the narratives of trans women and other queer Caribbean people, which includes accounts of some of the worst excesses of violence at the level of the state, community, society, family, and in interpersonal relationships. However, Attai is also careful to demonstrate that, and I quote, "Despite this violence, the resilience and agency trans women use to direct their own lives and actualize their gender identities and sexual desires," end of quote, are key enactments of gender and sexuality in the region. Further, he tells of the juxtaposition of state-sanctioned corrective violence and the ways in which trans women build communities with family and friends, doing so while enacting queer expressions of gender and sexuality, while they live party organized in their homelands and as they reimagine their belonging. In their various registers, gender and sexuality conjure meanings and experiences that are simultaneously diverse and related, liberating and policing, conceptual and messy and opaque. Black and Caribbean feminist theorizing names gender as ideologically and materially systemic, negotiations that appear at the structural, institutional, societal, personal, interpersonal, familial, and relational levels, overdetermined by race and capital accumulation in colonial, imperial, neoliberal state formations, hijacked and neutralizable by state and imperial global arrangements, co-opted as signifiers of progress, development, and, as Tracy Robinson says, political rectitude, especially in international context, or as suggestion as less an end in itself. Let me also clarify that even as I am interested in probing gender and sexuality as sites of violence, I am also keenly aware that they matter in the exercise of agency and freedom beyond the experience of violence. In their essay on gender, violence, and hegemonic projects, Magana Nayak and Jennifer Suchland contemplate how hegemonic projects of the state require gender for their reproduction. In this schema, gender as a site of violence is materially and institutionally maintained and produced through systems, beliefs, and practices of surveillance, rewards, punishment, and in connection with other valences of power and difference. Not surprising, though, there remains a reluctance among feminists whose biographies and experiences have been shaped by the colonial, imperial, neoliberal machinations of the state, to concede to gender, in particular, a place of primacy, particularly when rendered in line with the logics of what Sylvia Wynter refers to as the ethnoclass, man-woman, heterosexist, bourgeois, white, European binary. It is for this reason that an analysis of gendered arrangements, which observes gender as sites of violence, must be framed along the continuum of violences deployed to center the imperatives of state and global systems and how these reach into the lives of people in the everyday. And I do so by thinking about the ways in which, while not identical, gender and sexuality remain powerfully imbricated in our lives. I focus particularly on empirical research that I have conducted about violence against women and girls, based on data from interviews with representatives of state entities and civil society organizations. So, recent research in the Caribbean recorded lifetime prevalence rates for intimate partner violence in Guyana at 55%, 48% in Suriname, 44% in Trinidad and Tobago, and 39% in Grenada and Jamaica. All of these countries have recorded lifetime prevalence rates of intimate partner violence that are higher than the named global average of one in 3 women will experience some form of intimate partner violence over her lifetime, or gender-based violence over her lifetime, I should say. In the absence of recent studies of prevalence and incidence of sexual violence, TIIKM points to both UNODC, World Bank studies of crime in the Caribbean, and earlier UNDP reports on child sexual abuse to signal the magnitude of sexual violence against women and girls in the region. Apart from 3 Caribbean countries appearing in the top 10 of nations globally with highest reports of cases of rape against women, for 48% of adolescent girls across 9 countries in the region, their first sexual experience is reported as either forced or coerced. The murder of a 13-year-old girl who reported she had been repeatedly raped by a couple, the murder of her uncle, and the attempted murder of her father, while they all slept in their home, reverberated with great intensity and shock across the Caribbean. These, and I'm quoting Tracy Robinson here, what she calls these brief, repeated moments of public engagement, she has argued, in which it seems as if everyone in the nation is distressed about and disturbed by the pained bodies of women and girls who make the headlines, are by no means the entire landscape of public affect to violence against women, end of quote. The violences which result in the death of a child, her uncle, and serious injury to her father are simultaneously swift and slow in the making, visible and masked, heinous but also yet spectacularized in media. The edifice of gendered and sexual violence is often masked, undetectable in the everyday, normalized, trivialized, and propped up by systems and structures that do not serve the majority of us. For many, this violence exists as part of our everyday. Many of us feel, witness, manage, and experience grieve from violence, I should say. Centuries of analyses produced by racialized people, particularly racialized women under settled colonial regimes, are replete with the layered accounts of instantiations of a racist capitalism, that remains reliant on sexual and gendered violence for its maintenance. Whether experienced through the extractivist regimes of the plantation or transnational corporations, in which the environment and racialized groups of people are exploited in service of capital accumulation of a few, or through the everyday acts of coercion, control, and surveillance. Gendered and sexual violence and gender and sexuality as sites of violence are sanctioned and maintained through an expansive web of interconnected relations of power. As Halimah Deshong Unit has argued, ongoing manifestations of sexual and gendered violence and the responses to these harms must be understood in relation to a history of the violences of whiteness and the plantation world in the Caribbean. In her attempt to transcend the racialized and gendered erasures and violences of anthropogenic thought, Donna Haraway suggests that a racial heteropatriarchal capitalism, the plantation system. In a racial heteropatriarchal capitalism, the plantation system enacts and normalizes racial, heterosexist, and gendered violence in service of white supremacist capital accumulation. So that enactments of gendered violence, including sexual exploitation, that appear at the interpersonal, community, and state level remain interconnected as part of these broader processes of social, political, and economic organization of state, intrastate, and global relations. For Chandra Mohanty, confronting the current manifestation of neoliberal militarized regimes require, and Chandra Mohanty is writing this piece in 2011, but it's so relevant to what the sort of developments we see recently in terms of increased militarization in the Middle East, the levels of conflict that we see that is very much so imperialist in various African regions. Oftentimes when these situations are described, they're described as a feature of the present and a feature of the geographies confined to specific states, and the broader global machinations of power are not named. So that when Chandra Mohanty is here talking about increased militarization, she says militarization always involves masculinization and heterosexualization as linked state projects, and neoliberal economic arrangements are predicated on gendered and racialized divisions of labor and constructions of subjectivities, thus necessitating a feminist critique. In other words, gendered violence emerges as part of the securitized state, expressed in different historical moments across a range of colonial, imperial, and neoliberal formations of the nation, with its recreative internal and external enemies. She says, what Mohanty refers to as a biomilitarized body endures constant material and symbolic violence, as can be observed in the lives of indigenous, migrant, Muslim, race, class, and gendered bodies, constructing them as non-citizens, criminals, as what she calls bare life. As violence marks the flesh of those of us regarded as non-belongers, those criminalized, gender and sexuality as violence remains in constant connection to those arrangements of power and difference created and deployed in service of repressive state formation. Gender and sexuality matter as they remain in constant alliance with race, class, and religion in effecting violence. And I use the example in the Caribbean of an old retention of British slave law and legal practice, where a corroboration warning is often issued in cases of sexual violence where the complainant is a woman or a child. And this warning has to be read out before the jury goes to deliberate. And it basically reminds the jury that they must be careful in their deliberation and they must remember that women and children have a greater propensity for telling lies, for falsehoods. And I remember being in 2011 in a workshop for judges, where one judge was insisting that he will continue to read the corroboration warning until instructed to do otherwise formally. Whereas the other judges were like, well, this is a sexist retention, a very problematic retention from British legal practice, and it should be dispensed with. But that it still appears in the whole court rights and legal framework is problematic, and tells you something about how gender relations, gender and sexuality are systemic, and they continue to shape the state's capacity to provide redress for women and children in the context of gender and sexual violence. Right? So and in addition to these British British-derived legislation to address sexual violence, it is also critical to consider the presence and resonance of British slave codes, in which enslaved people were regarded as chattel, as well as the stated sanctioned sexual, physical and psychic harms against indigenous Afro and Indo-Caribbean people that featured as part of the colonial history of labor exploitation. This history is present in what has been termed by African American scholars as the adultification of Black and Brown Caribbean and African American girls, who tend to be sexualized, rendered developmentally older, and sexually exploited at higher rates than their white counterparts. It explains the findings of focus group research on children and child sexual abuse in the Eastern Caribbean, in which participants reported that adolescent girls are regarded in ways that suggest that they are sexually accessible to men, thus justifying men's sexual exploitation against them. The emergence and enforcement of Caribbean legislation to redress sexual violence against women, girls, and children more generally must be situated within these socio-historical contexts. Legal practice and the law, while important, remains out of reach as a viable remedy for sexual exploitation. In a 2008 presentation, Tracy Robinson remarked on how, as a collective, we engage in loving law, what she calls loving law, in ways that obscure our understanding of gendered violence as enmeshed in complex relations of power. What I have raised up to this point leads me to a central concern. How might we think about gendered violence and gender and sexuality as sites of violence in ways that bear witness to their spatial and temporal durability, while also avoiding the dangers of homogenizing their specific manifestations in the lives of differently located women, girls, children, trans, and queer people? My work has mainly focused, like I said, on gendered violence as manifested in intimate heterosexual relationships. I have also focused on media production of sexist, heterosexist, homophobic, and transphobic violence, and feminist methodologies for studying violence. I wish to use the remaining time to draw examples from research completed in the Eastern Caribbean country of Grenada, in which the focus was on intimate partner and sexual violence against women and girls. While gendered violence should not be reduced to or typologized into categories of sexual, intimate partner, psychological, and so on, I do analyze specific instantiations of these violences at the interpersonal level as simultaneously felt, that is, in flesh and material, enacted and maintained within these broader systems to which I referred earlier. I probe meanings of gendered violence, inclusive of how gender and sexuality, which while not reducible to, are often enacted as violence. The purpose of this analysis is not for me to be thematically expansive, but rather to show how what is often regarded as violence in familial and relationship contexts connects to larger systems, larger mechanisms and enactments at the community, societal, state, and global levels. I also set out to point to continuities of violence as part of these formations. So in this first example, State Prosecutor James laments challenges with cases involving sexual violence in which the legal complainant and the accused had been involved intimately prior to the allegation. So he goes on to talk about how these are some of the most difficult cases to prosecute because persons, of course, have a prior relationship, and at other times the victims find it difficult to face these persons. And of course, to get a conviction, it is difficult because there's a prior relationship. Juries tend to believe that the woman is probably just making things up, that she's angry with the man for something and she decides she's going to make this false allegation. And there's a stereotype that once you're in a relationship, you can't say no to any sort of sexual advances and so on and so on. And all these things make it difficult to get a conviction. Now, Caribbean law, court rights, legal procedures, and persons for whom who perform functions within the criminal justice system form part of historical and institutional arrangements which embed racist, sexist, heterosexist, and classist assumptions about those, in particular women and children, seeking redress for the material and psychological violences of gender and sexuality. Court rights, judicial decision-making, and the enactment of an engagement with domestic violence and other sexual offenses legislation maintain sexism and heterosexism in Caribbean law. Take, for example, what I referred to earlier as the history of corroboration warning in criminal cases involving sexual violence in which women or children are named as the virtual complainant. In these instances, judges are required to read the statement ahead of the deliberation, and this suggests that women tell falsehood. And I went through this earlier as I described what that was, the corroboration warning was about. But James's reference to the assumption by members of the jury that claims of sexual violence by women against former partners are likely to be false falls in line with the idea of consent as irrevocably given once given at the start of the legal contract of marriage, and a propensity by women to extract revenge following a failed intimate relationship. Gender here emerges as a mechanism of control and re-victimization of women in their appeals to the state for remedy in the face of interpersonal violence. Globally, cases involving rape and other manifestations of sexual violence are significantly underreported, and when they are, the attrition rates tend to be high. Criminal justice response to sexual violence have been found wanting, as they end up more harm producing and violent for women and children seeking redress. The sort of widespread nature of ubiquity of gendered violence in the everyday is difficult to confront in systems that inhere the very conditions that maintain such harms in the first place. The law, its enactment, law enforcement, and legal personnel and procedures thus become sources and sites of state-produced violence against women and children, as observed by Nicholas Attai against queer and trans people. In this next example, sorry, I just lost my where was I? I'll find it back here. Right. So in this next example that I provide, right. In this next example, right. I think about how participants in the Grenada research make connections between the violence of poverty and increased exposure to sexual violence. Livy, who has been a member of a women's organization for a significant period of time, recounted the following. She says, looking at risk factors or potential risk communities of sexual violence, and one of the indicators we are seeing is poverty. That poverty would trigger that kind of dependency of the violence, whether it's through a minor or whether it's through an older person. And persons are coming up saying that they're seeing persons staying in situations even though they know they are conscious of I should not be here. But because of the quote unquote level of poverty situation, they stay in sexual violence relationships. The convergence of economic deprivation and sexual violence in the lives of women and girls is poignantly expressed here by Levy's narrative. She makes clear how poverty compromises women's ability to navigate these uneven socio-sexual unions, which themselves feature gendered violence. Children are exposed to the violences of poverty, out of which sexual harms against them are furthered. In her activist scholarship, Andaye, the late Andaye from Guyana, argues that transforming relations of power in the lives of women means simultaneously addressing the economic and gendered violence to which women are far more likely to be exposed. Andaye's theorizing and practice converge around an analysis of capitalism, a Caribbean intellectual tradition which centers race, gender, and class as key to the making of the region, all of which are imbricated in unpacking women's experiences with unpaid labor, care, and violence. Gender is profoundly implicated as mechanisms of violence deployed by the state. However, Levy is also one to explain that experiences of sexual and intimate partner violence vary and include women outside of situations of poverty. She says it's varied. In fact, someone called me yesterday and had been pestering me since morning that there is an unmarried couple now and that highfalutin, meaning higher in society, middle class kind of person, who is tithing and would not allow, for example, cause my intervention would be called social services. No, they don't want to do that because they don't want to be seen. They don't want to be known, and the fact that the man is about to do something really bad. So this woman looking at her phone, she might be dead because they are waiting for somebody to intervene. The possibility of death looms large in the reality of women for whom intimate partner violence is repeated through both physical and non-physical acts. It informs women's decision to remain in unions that overwhelmingly compromise their ability to function autonomously. Women are often chided for remaining in these relationships in spite of the materiality of violence in their lives. To live in context of little to no familial community or state support could mean death for women. Feminists have long theorized intimate partner violence against women in the context of heterosexual unions as one of the worst excesses of patriarchal relations that manifest at the interpersonal level. Class converges with gender differently for women positioned as socially middle class. Social shame is cited as a force which determines some women's decision to avoid state support. However, shame also animates decision-making for women affected by poverty who often do not seek services. And I know in Shahana's, Professor Razul's own research on domestic violence, where she frames this as an everyday, ordinary occurrence, the fact that the way in which society functions to reinforce shame and secrecy, this sort of militates against women's possibility and ability to navigate and to make decisions about living in these situations. Beyond influencing women's decision to seek help from these harms, there is need to probe the arrangements and actions which create the affect of shame among women and children experiencing violence in the first place. Shame in this context is indeed gendered. The shame that women and children suffer in the face of felt, symbolic, and systemic violence emerges out of the very socio-political and socio-historic arrangements that produces gendered violence in the first place. Yet, our collective responsibility in how women experience shame remains unacknowledged. Here again, the neoliberal state is implicated. Michelle Rowley tells of the dangers for women, particularly working class women, when interpolated as maternal subjects by the state, as women appear for state support based on the absence of economic security. As some women appear in the absence of economic security, the maternal body, she says, is shamed and disciplined for an inability or unwillingness to conform to colonialist binary scripts of gender. This preoccupation with shaming women into binary gender conformity functions as yet another site of violence. Enactments of gender by the state in social relations and in institutions produce and maintain unconscionable levels of violence in the lives of women, children, and persons for whom gender and sexuality are enacted and experienced in non-normative ways. Eugene Barry cautions of the dangers of how gender masks, normalizes, and naturalizes uneven relations of power between women and the state. Thinking about gender and sexuality as sites of violence does not preclude analysis in feminist and queer studies of the convergence of gender and sexuality as performance, expressions of identity, as discursive practice, or even in the possibility for systemic change. However, grave concern remains in how violence appears in the rendering of gender and sexuality in ways that circumscribe the lives of women, children, and gender non-binary and non-conforming people. And I want to close. I want to close with just a few thoughts. Thinking about moving forward, looking back, and addressing gendered violence in the everyday. My reflections in this talk were really prompted by a desire to open up wider spaces for conceptualizing gendered violence, its durability, the relevance of gender and sexuality in its enactment, and possibilities for change. These reflections contemplate, like so many generations of women, girls, feminists, and sexual rights activists, a life without violence, with freedom as our point of departure. Caribbean feminists provide such fertile ground, in my estimation, from which to defy and transcend our violent inheritances. Eugene Barrow's proposition that, and I quote, "the past continuously ruptures the present, destabilizing linear notions of accomplishment, progress, achievement, and completion," end of quote, reminds us of our commitment to fracturing the very conditions and arrangements that create, institutionalize, and maintain gender and sexuality as violence and gendered violence. In the everyday and throughout the history of the region, persons with minoritized sexualities and genders, women, girls, and children have had to navigate these violences, the materiality of which form the basis of the most enduring feminist movements in the region. Race and class figure significantly in how gender and sexuality are experienced among these groups. What appears as contemporary enactments of violence in the everyday are profoundly connected to prior and future moments, to systems of state formation, and to economic, social, cultural, and political arrangements. In analyzing narratives of gendered violence provided by state and non-state actors, I note that while appearing at the individual level, these harms proliferate with an intensity given their connection to histories and systems of violence. As Caribbean feminist doers and thinkers continue to insist, our actions and strategies must center these connections in which gender and sexuality can continue to fundamentally matter. Thank you for listening. I know you're at the end of a very long and productive day for you, and so I would close here, and if there's time, we'll be happy to hear your thoughts and questions. Thank you.